In the last History of and Changes To video I made, we discussed Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. We talked about its conceptual evolution from a walk through a haunted house into an Omni-Mover dark ride, as well as its growing popularity that eventually made it into one of the most popular dark rides in the world. But one thing we neglected talking about altogether was its near-identical Florida counterpart that opened up 2 years after the original at the Magic Kingdom. Since both versions of the mansion opened up so close to one another, their histories are essentially intertwined, so this video is going to be focusing a lot less on the history of the Florida version, and more so the differences between it and the original. But before we get started, let's get a little bit of backstory on the Florida mansion. Interestingly enough, the story actually begins at Epcot. No, not that Epcot. Yeah, that Epcot, or better known as the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, which, if you don't know, was an idea of Walt Disney's from the early 60s to essentially build his own city where new and experimental technologies could be tested. Now, a big part of this project was going to be a new version of Disneyland next to the city. The new park would not only attract visitors and tourists from elsewhere in the country, giving the city the money it needs to survive, but it would also be a place for its residents to enjoy. So plans for the new Disneyland, or Magic Kingdom, were already set in motion by the mid-60s, with some slight park redesigns in place and clones of some of the most popular Disneyland attractions set to open there. Even ones that weren't officially opened yet in Disneyland, like the Haunted Mansion for example. However, plans for the Florida project were suddenly changed in 1966, when Walt Disney died. With him, the original Epcot plans sorta died out as well, just leaving the park. Not too long after Walt's death, the Imagineers behind the original Haunted Mansion picked the project back up, and eventually finished it in 1968. While they were still making the first mansion, they already knew about the plans to open a second one only a few years later, so they made duplicates of all the original props for the attraction and stored them for later on. Around that same time, they also decided that the new version of the ride would be longer, and include a few additional scenes that there wasn't enough space to include in the original. The Magic Kingdom's Haunted Mansion officially began its construction sometime in 1970, wrapped up less than a year later in early 1971. Over the next 6 to 7 months, the Imagineers finished up the attraction by putting in all the pre-made set pieces. But after they were finished with that, the attraction was opened alongside the rest of the park on October 1st of that same year. When the new Haunted Mansion first opened, it received much praise from guests, mainly for a lot of the same reasons the original did. With its use of innovative effects, original theming, and creative storytelling, the ride was almost instantly a hit. Even parkgoers who had also been on the California version were still impressed with exclusive scenes that weren't in the original. So, with that being said, let's get to talking about what all was different between the two. The biggest change between both mansions has to be the difference in their facades. If you remember from the first video, Disneyland's Haunted Mansion was largely designed in its final plantation style so it could fit in with the rest of its surrounding area, the New Orleans Square. But since the Magic Kingdom didn't get its own version of that same land and instead got the Liberty Square, the new mansion had to blend in with that. Since the architecture for the Liberty Square was mostly based off colonial times, the Haunted Mansion took on a new look. However, the Imagineers and artists eventually decided to give it more of a gothic style to better match the attraction's theme. For maybe around 10 years after it was first opened, the mansion kept the same tradition of the original, looking very well kept and maintained, but over the past couple of decades, Disney sort of allowed it to look more overgrown and unkempt to make it feel more abandoned, which does help with the overall haunted theming. The queues for both of the attractions were also similar enough as well. In both California and Florida, you basically walk around the front of the mansion and eventually get let inside. The only difference there being that in California, you end up going in through the front of the mansion, and in Florida you go in through the back, or what they call the servant's entrance. That wasn't until 2011, when Disney extended the original queue and added some new interactive elements to it, most of which were new tombs or tombstones that reference characters from the mansion. As for the actual interior of the mansion, the foyers, or rooms you go into before the stretching, or pre-show room, are somewhat different, as the Florida version is much darker than the original and features an additional changing portrait that isn't present in the California version. However, both of the mansion's stretching rooms are designed to look the same, and each ride has 2 of them to help with capacity. The only real difference is that in California, the stretching room also acts as an elevator, taking guests down to the park's basement level. If you don't know, the reason it does that is that way you can walk under the train tracks for the railroad, which happen to pass in between the mansion's facade and its show building. Over in Florida, the Haunted Mansion isn't anywhere near the railroad, but they kept this in effect by instead raising the pre-show room ceiling, as opposed to lowering its floor. After that, the Disneyland version dumps you into a hallway that passes underneath the tracks and eventually leads you into the loading area, while at the Magic Kingdom, the stretching room just dumps you directly into the loading area. Both loading areas look and act pretty much the same, except for the fact that the Disneyland version tilts and travels upwards after you get on, while the Magic Kingdom one stays level with the ground. This is because the ride's show building, unlike its loading area and hallway, are on the same level as its facade, not below it. Alright, now that the ride has officially begun, we get to finally see some of the bigger changes. The first scene you come across shows a set of paintings that quickly change when lightning strikes outside the room. While these aren't in the actual ride portion of the Disneyland attraction, the same portraits and effect can be found in the hallway that leads into the loading area. Likewise, the following library scene that showcases the Follow You bust isn't present in California either, but the moving bust effect can be found at the end of that same hallway. The next scene after that shows you a piano being played by a ghost, who's only noticeable from the shadowy cast. While this scene used to be completely exclusive to the Florida Mansion, a similar scene was later added to the California version in the 90s, when they introduced their own ghostly piano player to that ride's attic scene. The last completely new addition to the Florida Mansion was the Grand Staircase, which features multiple sets of stairs that run in all directions, some seemingly impossible. Surprisingly enough, the Grand Staircase scene wasn't a part of the ride until 2007. Up until that point, the space was just a darkened room with some spiderwebs and large spiders on the walls. Aside from that, there really aren't any huge differences between both mansions. Both have the endless hallway, the conservatorium, the corridor doors, seance room, ballroom, attic, and graveyard. However, they both do have their own distinct feel for each of these scenes, but that's more so because of lighting tweaks and differences in room size, as the Magic Kingdom version is a bit bigger than the original. Not unlike the original mansion, the attic in the Florida version has seen the most changes in the ride. While it never got the additional piano-playing ghost or Hatbox Ghost animatronic like the Disneyland version, it did see a few different incarnations of the bride character. Originally appearing more corpse-like at the beginning, it was later redesigned in the early 80s to look creepier. After that, it was redesigned again in the mid-90s to look a little bit less ghostly, and eventually got replaced altogether with the new Constance character in 2007. Lastly, the Florida Mansion also introduced new animated hitchhiking ghosts to the Haunted Mansion in 2011. Before, the hitchhiking ghosts were actual animatronics hidden on the opposite side of the mirror, making them appear transparent when you saw them in your ride vehicle. Now they're just projected onto the mirrors, which to me at least seems a little bit less impressive, but yeah, who even cares what I think. Like the Disneyland version of the ride, the Magic Kingdom attraction has also managed to stand out as one of Disney World's better dark rides. Since Florida's Mansion isn't at Disneyland and isn't as sacred as the original, since Walt didn't directly have a hand in its creation, it's been able to get toyed around with a lot more than the California version, with all the updates, new scenes, and various additions, which I do overall think is a good thing, as it allows today's Imagineers to be able to give their own spin to a classic attraction without ruining the original. Because despite my seemingly negative attitude about these things, not every new addition or update to a classic ride is a bad thing, and the Florida Mansion is a perfect example of that. While the mansion's storyline and general layout wasn't as different between the two domestic versions as it is between those and the two foreign versions, which, don't worry, are getting their own separate videos later, there were still plenty of big differences between both of the attractions. Hopefully, if the Haunted Mansion sees any more updates or large-scale changes in the future, they're put into effect at the Magic Kingdom, where they'll definitely be more appreciated than they would be if they replaced something in the original, which, like I said, should try and stay as close to its opening day version as possible.
So I'm at the Dead concert. I'm having a great time, right? And never mind. Check.